It is no surprise to anyone interested in the foreign affairs space that China is America's current pacing challenge, today and for the coming decade at least. And it is also no surprise that mitigating the potential for unintended altercations, either direct or indirect, requires dialogue. That is why U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in China to meet with President Xi Jinping this week. But the question is, why does America consider China a challenge at all? Can't we just be friends? Welcome back to another episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, John Mollick. A big thanks to all those returning, and an even bigger thanks to our first-time listeners. I think now we're on our 8th episode. We just finished our 7th last week, a discussion on Iran and Israel, and what the Iran attack meant for the region, and what it might mean in terms of an Israeli response. Why did all of this stuff happen, and where are we going to go with this in the coming months. So check that out if you haven't heard it yet. This week, I want to talk about a more direct challenge to the United States. And when I say direct, I mean by a competitor closer, at least in economic status and eventually in military status, to that of the United States, and that's China, particularly the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, of course, Americans have no issue with the Chinese people, as if I even need to say that. But right when I reference China this week, we're clearly talking about the Chinese Communist Party and the decisions that President Xi Jinping is making, and the path that he's chosen for China's future. So we're gonna talk about China. Complicated topic, but we're gonna tease out some key points here. Let me start. Typical caveat. Although I remain in the business, I do not speak for the Department of Defense or the United States Army or the United States government. I only speak for myself, and my opinions are from personal experience and open source information. That's it, okay? Now, the reason I want to have this discussion this week is because it's been in the media pretty heavily in the last few days here at the end of April that Secretary of State Blinken has traveled to China, and he met with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and then he eventually followed that up with a more programmatic and formatted discussion with President Xi Jinping. But as you might imagine, the more of the sausage was made, if you will, when Mr. Yi and Secretary Blinken had met and had some pretty substantive discussions. The real reason that Secretary Blinken is there, and he made this pretty clear, there's no reason to really to hide it, is because the United States and China really need to return to a place when dialogue is key to the relationship. Right? Things turned pretty bleak last year when we had the quote-unquote spy balloon incident, when we saw the balloon traveling and heading west to east over the U.S., and then eventually it was taken down and off the East Coast. I think it was down in the Carolinas, if I remember correctly, but. And the American public was upset, and China spying on us, and we had this. We had a little while there in the diplomatic relationship where we weren't speaking. Literally, we're not speaking, and that is not something that's healthy for global stability. When you have the two most powerful countries in the world not even communicating, and the relationship that they have will affect the entire world. Right now, it's economically, as they have the two largest GDPs across the world. And it's really akin to the relationship that the United States had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. There was a time in the early decades of the Cold War where the United States and the Soviet Union didn't really have any direct communication in order to head off any potential issues, unforeseen issues that nobody could call the other and ask, hey, is this really what's happening? What's going on here? Did you really shoot a nuclear weapon at us, or is this a practice event or a training exercise? Eventually that did happen, and the United States had installed the red phone, which was literally a red phone, where senior level government officials, to include the president, could pick up the red phone and call directly to Moscow and really work out any concerns that both had, so they didn't end up in this nuclear combat based on an unforeseen situation or a miscalculation, and now the world's gone. So I'm not saying that we are currently in that position with China. We definitely have two. We're similar in the way that we have two very powerful militaries and two very, very powerful economies, but we're not on the same level in terms of our tension. We're not literally armed and ready to go, if you will, like we were in the Soviet era. We're not in a position where we're teaching children, like I was in third grade, to crawl under our desk space in the event that the Soviet Union launches nukes at, Washington and in New York or whatever. That I think is less of a concern with the United States and China. I don't want to say it's zero concern, but it's certainly, I think it's fair to say that it's less of a concern. But nonetheless, the point being that maintaining dialogue between two countries that are at the very least competitors, I could argue in at least some of the relationship space between us and China that were adversaries, definitely adversaries in the intelligence world. Competitors, I'll give you, in the economic field. But it's better to talk than not talk. And so it was rightfully a big story this week when Antony Blinken went over, Secretary of State Blinken went over and worked through some of the potential trust issues that both have. And we're going to talk later in the episode on exactly what some of those are. So one of the ways to find out how these conversations go when senior leaders from states meet together and have conversations is you just read the readouts. You read what the Chinese government put out from their perspective, what the Americans put out from their perspective, and even though both are very well crafted and the words are chosen very carefully, if you have enough experience, if you know how to read these things, then you can tease out some real interesting tidbits. And I think that's the case just this week. Let's start with a couple quotes, at least from Foreign Minister Yi, when he said, quote, "China and the U.S. need to communicate clearly about our differences," end quote, "in order to, quote, minimize the risk of miscalculations and misunderstandings," end quote. Makes sense. That's exactly what I just said. That's what everybody wants. We want to minimize miscalculations in any front between the two parties. In terms of what Secretary Blinken's comments were, we can hear that now. Go ahead and just take a listen.
Well, good evening, everyone. 10 months ago, I traveled to the People's Republic of China at a time of profound tension between our countries, with the aim of stabilizing the relationship, reopening and strengthening our high-level channels of communication. Over a series of candid and constructive conversations I had then with President Xi and other senior officials, I made clear our policies and intentions and identified issues of shared interest where we might work together. Those discussions, which were followed by additional senior-level visits and meetings between our governments, helped lay the foundation for a productive summit between President Biden and President Xi in San Francisco at the end of last year. Our leaders agreed on concrete steps to cooperate on issues that matter to our people and matter to the world, and reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation. In the months since then, we focused intensively on advancing those commitments. I returned to China this week to take stock of where we've made progress and where more needs to be done so that we can deliver tangible results to the American people. That's been the focus of my meetings over the last 2 days with President Xi, with Director and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, with the Minister of Public Security, Wang Shouhong, and the Shanghai Party Secretary, Chen Jining.
Okay, similar to Foreign Minister Yi's comments, seem rather obvious in general, positive. But again, the takeaway here, the critical comment, the crux of the comment, if you will, is really the need for open dialogue. We don't need, like I had mentioned earlier, a misguided assumption, something like, just as an example, NATO's exercise Able Archer in 1983, okay, which was a large NATO nuclear training exercise that was at first glance assumed by the Soviets to really be a planning effort and not a training exercise. And if there wasn't an ability to pick up the phone, somebody could have done something really silly and said, hey, it looks like NATO is preparing for nuclear war. Let's press the red button and see what happens. And thankfully that didn't happen, right? This is, again, similar. We need to do the same thing with China. The situation, like I said, is not exactly the same, but nonetheless, both parties are very wealthy. Both have large militaries. Both have very strong political opinions. And any conflict between the two, in particular a military conflict, would have global impacts. So talking matters. All right, so a little bit more here on how the conversations went down. The meeting itself between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Yi took place at the Diayutai State Guest House in Beijing, it's a beautiful ancient garden facility with some modern buildings and centuries of history. I think I read 800 years, 8 centuries. They've been having senior level state visits there. So really, if you see the pictures, just a beautiful place. So typical in that sense, right? They're going to have a high level meetings. They're going to have it here. So there isn't anything atypical in terms of the location. Okay. But parenthetically though, how many cameras and microphones do we think are located there? Right. It's been there 800 years. Obviously we didn't have cameras 800 years ago, but nonetheless, right. It's been there forever and they've been having state meetings. So how many cameras, microphones? Thousands, right? I mean, I know everybody plays that game, but interesting to think about nonetheless. Like, is the command center there? Are there a bunch of Chinese intelligence officers from the CCP? Are they like sitting below in a bunker listening to all this stuff? I mean, is it all digital in the sense that it's virtual, like nobody's actually there? Interesting to think about. I'm sure this similar games get played everywhere else, and I'm sure China thinks the exact same way when they come and they stay at Blair House, for example, in Washington. But you can read books about this stuff and see how difficult it is for diplomats to travel, and really travel anywhere. Even when you're traveling and you're meeting with friends, you still have to be careful about intelligence collection. So you have to have like specific locations where you can have very confidential conversations. You can't just roll up into the dining room and talk about it because then everyone's going to hear. Okay, so back to the conversations. Lots of interesting comments came out of the readouts here that I think are mentioning. Foreign Minister Yi also said, quote, "Should China and the United States keep the right direction of moving forward with the stability or return to a downward spiral? This is a major question before our two countries and tests our sincerity and ability," end quote. Also, he said, quote, "Should our two sides lead international cooperation against global issues and achieve win-win for all, or engage in rivalry and confrontation, or even slide into conflict, which would be a lose-lose for all," end quote. Okay, good, positive, right? Sounds logical comments. That's the whole point that we're here. Now, however, though, some of the closed-door conversations, some of the closed-door sessions, there were some readouts and quotes that came, and they're a bit more antagonistic, and they detail a little bit more clearly why we have this consternation between the two countries. All right, so one of the quotes is, quote, "Taking endless measures," the United States is taking endless measures to suppress China's economy, trade, science, and technology, end quote. And, quote, "U.S. measures are not fair competition, but containment. And it is not removing risks, but creating risks," end quote. Now, for the readout quotes, I found most of them on a nice CNN article, so I'll link that in the episode notes if you want to see them, if you want to read them yourself. But nonetheless, the latter comments here really start to shape what China thinks about the U.S.'s behavior in terms of China on the world stage. Let's dig into the details a little bit here. The context. Right now, the U.S. and China are the world's two largest economies, and I'm going to use here the IMF forecasted nominal GDP numbers for 2024, okay? The U.S. at almost $29 trillion and China at $18.5 trillion. Right. For further context, the third largest is Germany at a little over $4 trillion. Right. To give you some perspective here. China and the U.S. together make up 44% of the world's GDP. 44%. Two countries, 44%. Well, what's the point? Obviously, what happens between these two nations matters. And it matters to literally everyone else. Right now, it's in the economic sphere, but what they do matters. Now, I got it. For those of you that are saying, well, the EU, you didn't consider, we're just going country by country here. The EU does have some of its members make certain economic decisions by rules and laws that the EU sets, but at the end of the day, many economic decisions are still made at home in each country's capital. See the military support to Ukraine. Okay, so we're just going to go country by country here. Let me head off any comments there about the EU. Anyway, trade between these two countries is astronomical, and it really helps shape and mold the global economy because the China and the U.S. both consume and produce so much that how well that goes often leads to positive or negative effects globally. Now, you'd think on its face that isn't an issue, right? I mean, why would China be complaining about the United States taking measures to inhibit China in the economic sphere if, China produces things and the United States produces things, people buy things, other countries buy things, we're just competing, that's not a big deal. But not so, in particular in the manufacturing world. The US and Europe, in particular, have a modern belief in child welfare reforms, slave labor, and women in the workplace that China just doesn't really view equally. So when China forces humans into factories, literally, to work nearly endless hours in debilitating conditions, producing cheap goods, the US and Europe simply can't compete. We can't compete fairly because we have different laws and what we see as ethics that restrict us from putting people into those conditions. We believe in a 40-hour work week. We believe in spending time with your family and, work-life balance, something that's being discussed in recent years, and as it should be. So there's already an imbalance built in to the economic competition because the Chinese economy allows for the production of very cheap goods because the labor costs are drastically lower than that of the United States. So how can you really compete in a quote fair way, right? At least that's how the US looks at it. It's not fair. The West is restricted to certain things because we happen to believe in human rights in our way. And China says, pound salt, this has nothing to do with what we do with our labor standards, has nothing to do with you. And if we want to produce cheap goods, we're going to, and you're going to buy it. And it is what it is. Now, we could go back and forth and we can have discussions about moral relativity and moral subjectivity and if it's either right or good or bad. But none of that really matters at this point. What matters in particular is that China isn't changing its human rights perspective, and nor is the West. Full stop right now. It's just not happening today, and it's not happening anytime in the future, in the near future. So it is true that China can produce its goods much more cheaply. So how does the U.S. compete? What they do is they end up mitigating some of China's output. They do this by limiting advanced chip sales to China, for example, so they can't be as efficient in their production capacity. They apply sanctions on companies like Huawei and ZTE, which, like TikTok, aren't even really private companies, but nonetheless. They label China a currency manipulator, which, if given the evidence and given the data by the U.S., is true. And they limit what China calls businesses, as I just mentioned, like TikTok, and calls out the fact that there's no separation or very little separation between the CCP and these quote-unquote private entities. So China's upset and says, well, listen, we're just operating in our way, and now the U.S. and the West and the EU, whatever, they're in the business of trying to force China and other countries across the world to operate on the West's timeline and with the West's ethics and the rest of it. So now we have competition and we have a problem, and we have to have dialogue in order to work this thing out. The fear I have is that this is just not going to change. It's not going to change anytime soon. Both countries have solid foundations on how they would like to operate. The U.S. is not going to back away from capitalism. The CCP is not going to back away from nation-controlled economies. I don't see China having some breakthrough in its ethical perspective on women in the workplace. I don't see that. And I don't see the West turning back the clock in throwing 12-year-olds into gas stations, pumping gas for people going to work or whatever, right? It's just not going to happen. So how do the two countries maintain the balance? The problem with the argument is that China, while it's making the claim that its own viewpoints are theirs and should not be meddled with, they're also not being honest about why they do what they do and how they do what they do. It's not just about a perspective. It's not just about a political standpoint. It's about China claiming they're doing A, but they're ultimately doing B, and then not even admitting that C even exists. And we're going to talk about some of this. Let's just take a minute and let's move on to some of the comments that came from President Xi himself, right? These are a little bit more flowery because obviously he's in a different position. But from his readout, when he met with Secretary Blinken, he said, quote, "China is happy to see a confident, open, prosperous, and thriving United States," end quote. A very well-crafted statement, if you ask me. Although, in my view, it's technically not true, okay? The U.S. being, quote, confident, open, prosperous, and thriving, end quote, doesn't curtail China's economic growth. But the statement does leave out some nuance, right? Let me give you an example. In the past few weeks, FBI Director Christopher Wray testified to Congress about a secret malware attack by the Chinese Communist Party on many industrial port cranes along the East Coast. Now, without getting too specific, basically China had inserted dormant malware into routers that were located within these cranes. And in doing some forensic analysis on the code, the malware was designed to be activated if triggered at some point in the future. So ultimately, at any time, at the time of China's choosing, the malware would activate and the cranes would be directed by the CCP, not the companies that owned them. This could, as you might imagine, have a dangerous impact on shipping and trade globally. Now, ask yourself, which is something that the FBI director pointed out himself during testimony to Congress, what's the purpose of such a move? If China was interested in a, quote, prosperous and thriving U.S., why would they feel the need to insert malicious malware into our trade and production capacities? That doesn't seem to add up. You may ask, well, maybe those cranes are used to transport military equipment and China was simply preparing for an eventual war and didn't really want to damage the U.S.'s trade operations, but eventually maybe its military capacity. Okay, maybe. There is some logic there. But if China, as it claims, is not an enemy of the U.S., right, and it's just interested in being friends and moving forward and everyone getting rich, in a sense, why would it ever need to worry about a war with the U.S.? We're supposed to be friends, not enemies. Is China simply hedging against a future plan to retake Taiwan by force? Is that what they're thinking? And for those that say, well, the U.S. does this type of stuff also sometimes, but it's not the same. That malware's been there for over 5 years. That doesn't seem like a military purpose to me. And I can assure you, the U.S. isn't in the business of sabotaging China's economy with secret malware. Would we do it during a time of war? Sure. Right? Fair game, if you will. Offensive cyber operations are a legitimate military planning factor. No doubt. We plan for it in today's military. I can attest to that. Fair game. But we don't play that game in the economic sphere. We're pretty open about our desire for China to change its economic policies. We don't do it in an underhanded way. The U.S. is open when it tells China and the world what it would like China to do to be balanced and fair in the economic playground. At this point, we get to a place where we say, is this the chicken or the egg? Based on that example that I just gave. Did China start it, if you will, by lying about what it does to other countries across the world to prosper, both economically and militarily? Or is China responding to what it thinks is the United States playing games and having been playing games for decades? And so it's fair game for China to install malware in the cranes, because the U.S. has just spent the last 100 years messing with everybody else. All's well in love and war, right? I'd leave the answer to the philosophers maybe, or to historians of this relationship that have a bit more experience than I do. What I would say from my standpoint, meaning just looking at this over the last 5-10 years, is that and seeing some of the behavior coming out of China, I get where countries that aren't necessarily allies with the United States might be disenfranchised with its behavior, but nonetheless, China is really involved in a lot of underhanded dealings on many, many aspects of its political policies. It's often just not telling the truth. So this leads me to another subtopic in this conversation on the back and forth that was just in the media this week, when the United States Congress voted to force TikTok to remove itself from ByteDance's control, and the ByteDance being the parent company, within a year, and change its algorithms. Now, as an aside, understand the language trick here that the CCP uses. TikTok claims it doesn't give the Chinese Communist Party anything, which is technically true because it gives all of its data to ByteDance, which is, again, its parent company, who then gives it to the CCP. So when you may have seen the CEO of TikTok testify in front of Congress and make the claim under oath that TikTok doesn't do anything nefarious with the data, what he did admit to is that he gives all the data to ByteDance, and ByteDance gives the data to the Communist Party. So a little play on words there. Anyways, what's the real issue here? Let me give you an explanation. Before the bill came to the floor of the House to decide as to what to do about TikTok, a procedural vote was held for 50 representatives, 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans. They were asked to vote on whether the bill should even come to the floor for a full House vote. Right before the procedural vote out of the Energy and Commerce Committees, where it came from, the 50 representatives were given a classified briefing on what the intelligence community knew about TikTok and its behaviors, its relationship with ByteDance, and on and on. At the end of the brief, all 50 reps voted to send the bill to the full floor. All 50. What does that tell you? It tells you that what the public knows about TikTok isn't what the IC knows. China isn't playing fair in this regard, at least specifically with TikTok. I can't say much more other than to say this is going to be a challenging, but just you're going to have to trust the government in this realm. Okay? I get it. But TikTok is not what you think it is. Now, I don't want to go too far into this particular conversation about TikTok because we're going to do a whole nother episode on it. But just know it's another aspect of China's underhanded play. Okay? Now, let me highlight a difference too for those that say, well, listen, the U.S. uses information operations to influence people. If you're saying that China takes the data of TikTok users and wants to influence people, that's fair game. Everybody else did it, right? The U.S. did it, and the West did it with Radio Free Europe. We did it with Radio Liberty. But again, these were out in the open. The U.S. simply played news articles from a Western perspective in an attempt to educate those behind the Iron Curtain or behind, the wall in Berlin. And even though they were CIA initiatives and they fell into the information or intelligence domain because of that, the U.S. didn't respond with, well, I have no idea what these radio messages are. I didn't set them up and I'm not doing it, right? The U.S., it was obvious the U.S. was using these radio stations and there were other avenues, TV and other things, to influence. But it was, for the most part, out in the open. It was part of our policy. That's not what China's doing. China is lying, and claiming that a private entity, which what it calls a private entity, which it isn't, is simply just there to make money and just happens to be owned by China. It is not the case. And ultimately, regardless of whether the influencer is good or bad or whether they own your data or not, but it's undermining the West's in the globe. It's undermining the world's trust in capitalism and how business works across the globe. And if you're a member of the West and you support Western ideals, then you clearly don't want that to happen, right? Okay. Let me give you another example here, but one that I hope should help define what's within the fair game boundaries, if you will, and what I would consider unfair behavior, like TikTok, and fair behavior in economic and other competition between the two countries. In 2015, the Chinese government, if you recall, hacked the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and stole data from approximately like 4 million people. Okay. Why OPM? Because this is the organization that has all of the information on U.S. service members and information on their security backgrounds. China wanted to know who was in the military, who their families were, and what security clearances they held. It was a devastating day for the U.S. in terms of national security. I remember receiving the famous letter myself, as did my wife, from OPM that said something like, "We regret to inform you that because you're in the national security sphere, all of your personal information and your wife's is now in the hands of the CCP." Damn. Now, working in my field, I already believed that China, Russia, and others potentially had information about me in some capacity. I mean, not because I'm special by any means, but just because I happen to be in the business. And I accepted that fact. But admittedly, it did hit a little harder when we read it in print. Anyways, do you know what the U.S. did in response? And this is the point. Nothing. We didn't recall any ambassadors to be lectured in Washington. We didn't attack a Chinese military facility. In essence, we didn't do anything. In other words, that said, good job. You got us. You were able to hack a legitimate target in our eyes. Stealing military-related information is fair game. It's what countries do. The U.S. does it, Russia does it, China does it. We all have spies, sources, collection assets, fake diplomats, all of it. We all do that. It's all in the legitimate world. It's in this legitimate spy versus spy world. The same is the case for the so-called spy balloon. The U.S. dropped it from the sky because it was collecting. Leave it there. But nobody was really upset about it. Of course, politicians came out and riled up some constituents. But in reality, the U.S. didn't do anything to push back on the spy balloon in that way, in that instance either. But is implanting malware into port cranes legitimate? Is manipulating TikTok to influence millions of Americans and lying about its status legitimate? My answer is no. Again, to me, it undermines the trust in capitalism and economic freedom globally. And that's clearly something the U.S. isn't going to support. You could decide for yourself, but the points I'm trying to make here is that one group in this debate, one group on this side, isn't being completely honest. I know the U.S. isn't always honest itself. And as my notorious BIG fans will know, quote, there's rules to this game, and China doesn't like playing within them. Now, I'll go a little farther. And this is really why the latest meetings were held, that the U.S. and China do have mutual interests, at least theoretically. And they want to try to continue to work together on, again, at least that's the claim, because theoretically we should, like climate change, human rights, narcotics trafficking. I know the U.S. wants to collect some wins and demonstrate its China relationship isn't all bad, spy, so as to not scare the public into thinking this is really another Cold War. The problem is, it is. And many analysts are saying just that. And it's because of topics just like this, where China isn't being honest even about the things that we can work together on. Human rights. The CCP hasn't changed its policy on the Uyghurs. The Muslim citizens it forces into labor camps because of their religious differences. Right? That they haven't made that change. They haven't made any real substantive changes about climate policy. It claims to want to be carbon neutral by 2060, and it wants to peak its carbon emissions by 2030. I'll believe it when I see it. And the narcotics trade potential collaboration, it's just not believable either. The North America's illicit fentanyl production comes from Mexico and is made with Chinese liquid fentanyl. And knowing how observant the CCP is to all of the things that's related within its economy, you can't tell me the CCP isn't aware that that's a problem. Now, I understand governments, no matter how connected, can't know everything, right? Orwell tells us that in 1984. But the amount of liquid fentanyl coming out of China, some estimates are 97% of the world's fentanyl begins in China, is astoundingly large. You can't tell me the CCP isn't aware or even complicit in it. All of these points relate to the economy mostly, and even some military intelligence stuff, as we've talked about. And we haven't even touched on the elephant in the room, to use a dead cliche, and that's Taiwan, which will also be another independent episode because it's just too much to cover here. I'll just say at this point that regardless of what happens in our relationship with China regarding spy stuff in the economy, Taiwan is also going to become a problem. The CCP believes fundamentally in the reunification of China. Right now, as long as the U.S. and Europe continue to support a one China policy, keeping official diplomatic relations with Beijing, and as long as Taipei City doesn't declare some type of complete independence, the problem won't necessarily rise. It'll just kind of simmer. However, I don't think that lasts forever. And it'll likely change once China feels it can compete with the U.S. militarily. Some estimates say by 2027. I think that's a little early, but nonetheless. Another variable here is the Philippines. China continues to extend its influence into the South China Sea, encroaching into Philippine waters to test the waters, if you will. They're using the Philippines as a test case so they can assess how the U.S. will respond if continuously provoked because of the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. In Blinken's words, are ironclad. So knowing that when the China plays games with some of those fishing vessels in the South China Sea against the Philippines, and they make claims to international waters, accepted internationally, but China claims that they're theirs. They're really just kind of testing the U.S. in its resolve to see how they'll respond, because the day when they want to go after Taiwan is going to come. So let me try and pull this all together and summarize what I'm trying to convey here in the episode. China and the U.S. are the two most powerful countries in the world economically, soon, potentially, militarily. And their relationship in all domains matters greatly to global stability. And smartly, each country's leaders are continuing their dialogue to mitigate unforeseen misunderstandings that can lead to military conflict, which we don't want. Ultimately, as much as we talk about American power, NATO, Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, no one really wants war. If you've been there, you know. And China and the U.S. seem to have a semi-productive discussion this week to keep those lines of communication open, and that's good. The problem, though, is that neither country really trusts the other. And as much as I take the risk to be calling biased and skewed, China isn't playing fair in the same way that the U.S. is, by mixing private companies and government collection and surreptitiously inserting malware into mainly economic production domains. When we haven't even talked about standing up fake police stations to harass U.S. citizens in New York City, just to name a few problems. They're not playing the game by the pre-established rules, similar to when Vladimir Putin tried to assassinate British citizens in Britain. Stealing military data? Fine. Spying with balloons or satellites? Fair game. But pretending to desire common ground and then not even being honest there, fentanyl, is what the U.S. is concerned about. The current government in China is simply fundamentally different than the West's idea in their political ideologies, and at times completely opposite. And as much as we try to keep the peace, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work. Many analysts, for example, are slowly beginning to admit that we've entered a Cold War II. Just search the term and you'll be inundated with articles on the topic. Sometimes opposing countries just simply don't see the world through the same lens. And that reality can't be reconciled. Either one of them collapses like the Soviet Union, or a stalemate ensues in North and South Korea. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. And given the fundamental differences between the U.S. and China, even within a vibrant trade environment like now, in my mind, won't keep the conflict from coming someday. So this week is a is a positive development. What we don't want is a miscalculation. We don't want something to happen, someone to make a decision on the U.S. or the Chinese side, whether it be with, a boat sinking outside the shore in the South China Sea with a Philippine Coast Guard ship, right? Or, some type of a cyber event that was unintended. The target was unintended, something like that. So dialogue matters. It mattered during the first Cold War. And if you want to call this the Second Cold War, it matters as well. But much like Cold War I, even though the Soviet Union was trying to kind of shift towards the West a little bit with Gorbachev and Glasnost, ultimately the two visions of the world couldn't be reconciled. Now, thankfully, again, from the American perspective, the Soviet Union collapsed and we all moved on. This is a potential for China. I don't get too deep into this, but some analysts view the continuing path that we're on right now between the United States continues to grow. It gets, we have the most advanced military. Our GDP continues to grow. China continues to grow its military. Its GDP grows, and we go forward. But there are a lot of potential catastrophes coming down the road for China too. It's one child policy has really wreaked havoc on its population growth statistics, and they're really going to be upside down in the next couple of decades. And potentially that could crush the economy, and we may not even have to deal with it. But assuming some of those potentialities don't come to fruition, we're just going to continue ourselves down a path. Now, hopefully we find ourselves in a Soviet Union-like state in that we don't meet head-to-head. But the bad news in the pessimistic view is China will be powerful enough, wealthy enough, have a large enough military by the time it wants to take Taiwan, and the United States is going to have to step in some way. For the time being, though, hopefully we can keep that dialogue going, and fingers crossed we can avoid. I don't think it'll happen, but fingers crossed we can avoid that ultimate negative end. Okay, thanks for coming in again today with us here, episode 8 on headlines and history. As we always, when we close, be sure to email at any time, John Malik at headlinesandhistory.com. You can find me on social, YouTube, Instagram at Headlines and History. You can message me there. In the coming weeks, I don't know exactly when, but we're gonna be shifting into having some guests on to join us. We're really going to work on getting some really smart and experienced people to give us some wider perspective and pick their brains on some of these topics that we're talking about here, from both the academic world, the military world, and the civilian world, and we'll get some conversations going with some great people. So look forward to that in the future. Also, I have some exciting news. I'll be participating in an interview in early June that I think you'll find pretty interesting. I have it scheduled. I've got some more to share with you in the coming weeks. It'll have a little bit more of a law enforcement focus, but nonetheless, I think it'll be really fun. When I get some more details solidified, I'll let everybody know. But look for a pretty cool interview coming out in early June that I think, like I said, everybody should be interested in. So any questions, email me at any time. Headlines in History. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time.